As long as humans have existed, they have looked out into the night sky and postulated the existence of gods and demigods. To these deities, they ascribed a broad gamut of activities that influence the natural realm, from the provision of crops to causing extreme weather events to influencing the celestial bodies. But then, as our understanding of nature evolved and developed, we were able to describe more and more of these natural phenomena using newly discovered scientific laws. And it seemed then, after this, that the need for these meddling deities, these meddling gods, was increasingly unnecessary. Taking this viewpoint and extrapolating to an extreme results in the philosophy of scientism. This is the idea that all of reality is nothing more than atoms dancing to the beat of the laws of nature, that everything can eventually be described by scientific laws. Now, this idea is by now quite pervasive in Western culture in particular, and has grown in popularity over the last few centuries. To give you an example from modern pop culture, I remember watching late night TV presenter James Corden being interviewed by comedian John Bishop. And when John Bishop asked Corden about his Christian upbringing, he responded like this. He said, "I have a hunch that there might be something out there, but at the end of the day, you can't argue with science." In this video, I want to ask precisely that question. Is there a dichotomy, an insurmountable dichotomy between science and belief in God? Now, to address this question, the science of origin is the obvious domain of investigation, since any study of origins will have obvious theological and philosophical implications. So I want to pick out a couple of examples from science that I hope will show you that not only is there not a sharp and insurmountable dichotomy between science and belief in God, but actually in these examples, we see an affirmative case for belief in a creator God. Now, in the first example we're going to look at is from the area of cosmology. Now, cosmology is the study of how the universe changes on the largest scales. Now, before the era of modern cosmology, the consensus view had been that the universe was past eternal. In other words, that the universe existed infinitely into the past. On the other hand, the Judeo-Christian view has always maintained that the universe had a beginning, that the universe was created at some finite time in the past. Now, for most of our history, there was no real evidence either way. There was no evidence to back up either case. This began to change in 1929 when American astronomer Edwin Hubble first discovered that all of the galaxies in the sky are receding away from each other. You can imagine this like dots on an inflatable balloon. Each of the dots receding away from each other as the balloon expands. Now, this suggested that the universe was expanding, the fact that he observed all of the galaxies receding away from each other. Now, if the universe is expanding and you run the clock backwards, that means as we go back in time, the universe is contracting. And if you extrapolate this idea to its extreme, you potentially end at a point when all of the observable universe is condensed into a single point. This is what physicists call a singularity. This would mark the beginning, time zero, if you like. Now, to add some credence to this interpretation of Hubble's results, we note that Einstein's theory of general relativity, which he published over a decade before Hubble's results, had actually had solutions that involved expanding cosmologies that began at a finite time. In other words, Einstein's equations admitted solutions that agreed with Hubble's observation. Now, despite the fact that we had mounting observational evidence and theoretical evidence, most scientists and most physicists remained committed to the idea of an eternal universe. In fact, Einstein introduced a new term into his equation in order to recover the eternal universe, a fact that he later recanted as his greatest blunder, actually. So we actually have to wait for another 4 decades after Hubble's result, or just under 4 decades after Hubble's result, before the shift from an eternal universe to a finite universe actually happened. And that paradigm shift was precipitated by an accidental discovery by 2 American astronomers called Penzias and Wilson. And what Penzias and Wilson discovered is some leftover radiation from the earliest moments of our universe. In other words, from a time just after that initial beginning of the universe. And the radiation that they discovered, which we now call the cosmic microwave background radiation, or the CMB for short, was consistent with a universe with a beginning, but inconsistent with the static eternal universes that people had believed up to that point. This is probably, arguably, the most important discovery in all of cosmology, that the universe began to exist. This point at the beginning is the point we call the Big Bang singularity. Penzias and Wilson went on to win the Nobel Prize for that discovery, and in fact, these Big Bang cosmologies based on this idea that the universe began to exist at some finite time in the past proved to be very successful in explaining the large-scale structure of our universe. And in fact, they remain the standard paradigm for cosmologists today. Now, the philosophical implications of a universe with a beginning can hardly be understated. To understand why, let's consider the following argument that I'm going to express to you in a form that logicians call propositional form. So premise 1 of this argument goes like this: everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Premise 2 goes like this: the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, this argument is an example of what we call a logically valid argument. In other words, if the premises are true, the conclusion logically has to follow. In other words, the conclusion logically has to be true if the premises are true. Now, the second premise, the universe began to exist, we're accepting as true on the strength of the Big Bang cosmological models. The first premise is what is sometimes known as the causality principle, or the causality axiom, the statement that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Now, this has to be true because if you imagine a universe where this premise is false, in other words, things could come into existence without an underlying mechanism, without an underlying cause, then we wouldn't be able to do science in the first place. In other words, we wouldn't be able to account for uncaused things popping into existence randomly and without cause. In other words, to believe that the causality axiom is false is to believe that an elephant can pop into existence in the room where you are right now. A completely preposterous belief. That belief would be more mysterious, more ethereal, more superstitious, more anti-scientific than any belief that a Christian might have. So we accept premise 1 as true. The causality principle is also true. So it logically follows then that the universe must have a cause, because these 2 premises are true and this argument is a valid argument. So then, can we say anything more? If the universe has a cause, can we say anything about the cause? Can we infer anything about the cause? And again, I think we can. You see, the Big Bang singularity, this beginning of our universe, is the point where both space and time began to exist. Therefore, the cause must be spaceless and timeless. We also know that our universe is immense. Therefore, we can conclude that the cause must be extraordinarily powerful. We also know that the universe contains rational and conscious minds, like us. Therefore, the cause must be a conscious mind. And when you put all of this together, the picture you get is that the universe was caused by a spaceless, timeless, extraordinarily powerful conscious mind. And these are easily recognizable as classical descriptions of the Judeo-Christian God. It's also worth noting that these descriptions are at odds with, say, the gods of pantheism or the pagan gods of the Greeks and Romans. So I agree with the conclusion of Arno Penzias. This was the same Penzias who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1965. And he says this: "The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted if I had only the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Now, one objection that might be raised against this cosmological argument for God's existence is that these Big Bang models are unreliable at the very earliest times that I'm calling the beginning, or this moment of the Big Bang singularity. And strictly speaking, that is true. The energy density and the temperature of the universe become infinite right at that moment that we want to call the beginning. But even though the models break down right at that earliest moment, I still think there are good grounds for believing that the prediction that the universe had a beginning still holds up, even if the models don't. For example, the philosophical principle at play in this objection is that our model contains what Aristotle called actual infinities, and we don't believe that physically reasonable models should contain actual infinities. But of course, eternal models also contain actual infinities, just actual infinities of a different type of nature. In eternal models, we require space to traverse an infinite amount of time to reach the present moment. And this is another type of actual infinity, and this seems logically impossible. It seems logically impossible that space would be able to traverse an infinite amount of time to get to the point we call now. Another reason for preferring the universe with a beginning over these eternal models is the problem of entropy. Now, entropy in this non-technical setting can be understood as a measure of disorder. And according to the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy of a closed system only ever increases. In other words, disorder increases. Now, if the universe has existed forever and disorder only ever increases of the entire universe, then there could be no order, no structure, no stars, and ultimately no life at the present moment. On the aggregate of the evidence then, I agree with the evaluation of the great British physicist Edmund Whittaker when he says of the Big Bang, "There is no grounds for supposing that matter and energy existed before and was suddenly galvanized into action. For what could distinguish that moment from all other moments in eternity? It is simpler to postulate creation ex nihilo, divine will constituting nature from nothingness." But we also see a second type of fine-tuning in our universe. It appears that the initial conditions in the universe at that beginning point, at that Big Bang singularity, were also exquisitely and precisely fine-tuned. To give you a concrete example, let's look at what the entropy was like at that beginning. Now, as I mentioned earlier, entropy in this non-technical setting can be considered a measure of disorder. And as I already mentioned, according to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy is only ever increasing. That means disorder or disorganization has been increasing since the beginning of the universe. And yet, we live in a universe that is full of order. We have structure and galaxies and stars and conscious life. That means that if we have so much order today and the universe has only been increasing in disorder since the earliest moment, that the earliest moments in the universe must have been in a very, very special low entropy state. In other words, the universe at the beginning must have been in this exquisitely tuned, low entropy, smooth configuration. Now, it's almost pointless to tell you the numbers involved here, since they're so much larger than any of the numbers that we experience in our everyday life, and we just have no intuition for dealing with numbers of this magnitude. But here goes. The chances of our universe being in this very special low entropy state by chance, in other words, the probability that our universe was in this state by chance, is 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. So that's a double exponential, 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. Now, this number is incomprehensibly big. I mean, this number, you couldn't even write down this number in ordinary decimal form because it would involve more zeros than there are atoms in the universe. You can imagine a situation where, say, for example, you have 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123 hypothetical balls in a hypothetical bag. Now that's one very large bag. And then in all of these balls, you put in one ball that has a different color, right? So you have 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123 blue balls, and then you put one red ball into this bag. And then remember that the number of balls in this bag is larger than the number of atoms in the universe by a long way. And then you imagine that you pick out the one red ball by chance. I mean, if I actually did that, you wouldn't believe it was chance. You would assume that the game was rigged. You would be very, very suspicious if I was able to pick out that one ball by chance. It's the very same with our universe. It's hard to believe that the initial conditions of our universe could have been in this very special state by chance. Even physicist and atheist Sir Fred Hoyle concedes that a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect monkeyed with physics. In summary then, rather than find a sharp and insurmountable dichotomy between science and a belief in God, we have actually found that the ancient Christian teachings that God created and sustains the universe actually anticipated what scientists would discover several millennia later. As the Apostle Paul wrote to the Colossian church 2,000 years ago, "He is before all things, and in him all things hold together."